Research on the laws of war in the 19th century has mainly focused on Europe and the US, often skipping from the 1815 Congress of Vienna to the 1864 Geneva Conventions. The period before 1864, however, is largely overlooked in the study of international humanitarian law. As we will learn in this dialogue with Dr. Tania Ixchel Atilano, this also creates the false impression that there were no practices of international law before the West came up with this notion. We spoke to Europe-based Mexican scholar Dr. Tania Ixchel Atilano about this gap and how it restricts our understandings of state sovereignty, warfare, and other concepts of key importance to the field of peace and conflict studies. Tania's work builds on her book titled International Criminal Law in Mexico, published with Astor Press Springer. This is the first monograph on international criminal law in Mexico. In her new book project, Tania examines how the laws of war were applied in the context of the French intervention in Mexico between 1862 and 1867. In 1864, Maximilian, an Austrian archduke, was installed as Emperor of Mexico as part of France's attempt to establish a satellite monarchy under Napoleon III. But the intervention attempt failed. Maximilian was captured, sentenced to death by a Mexican court, and then executed during the government of President Benito Juarez in 1867. Tania, let's begin with a basic question. How would you describe the subject of your research? What is the most exciting and what is the most challenging aspect of your work?
It is history of the laws of war, and especially how actors engaged with international law and the customs and usages of war in a post-colonial state like it was Mexico, and especially vis-a-vis European actors, like in the specific case of the French intervention in Mexico with the French Empire of Napoleon III. I guess the most exciting would be like discovering all these new things and getting to know how was it in the 19th century and how important it was, international law and the laws of war, even maybe as relevant or even more relevant as it is today. Yes. The most challenging would be that like selecting all the materials, because there are many in archives or even in online repositories. Thanks to digitalization, there is a lot of material available. So, I guess the most challenging part would be like selecting all this amount of material.
What sparked your interest in the study of international humanitarian law, and what motivated you to take this particular perspective?
So what sparked my interest was that while I was doing my doctoral research, that is about the implementation of international criminal law rules in the domestic legal order, in the Mexican domestic legal order, I stumbled on criminal provision that it's called violations to the duties of humanity. So it kind of intrigued me because the content of the provision is not related to crimes against humanity, but rather it protects civilians and wounded soldiers and so on and so forth. So I started doing research in that, and it related to the French intervention in Mexico. So I thought it was a very good place to start on how newly independent states in Latin America engage with international law and international humanitarian law.
What makes the case of the French intervention in Mexico between 1862 and 1867 so relevant to academic debates and practices of international humanitarian law?
So we usually study that Latin American states, or in the particular case of Mexico, for example, criminal law, that we always adopt that tradition or the provisions of that come from Europe, and that we just adopt it, but that somehow we don't have any agency or particular innovative agency. So what really surprised me is that actually there was a lot of innovative thinking when they were struggling on how to make international law valid towards them, how to make really the principle of sovereignty effective, equality of sovereign states, and so on. So they really had to think in innovative solutions and that's what they did. I mean, they thought and improved like the standard that was at the day.
How does or should this discussion matter to the study of international humanitarian law beyond the specific case of Mexico in the 19th century?
Firstly, it's when we look at the history of armed conflicts in the 19th century, they are usually divided in intra-European wars and colonial wars. But the French intervention is neither of both because Mexico was a sovereign nation state. So this makes it different. And then, of course, there was the engagement of non-state actors and state actors from both sides. And this also, and both engage with international law and the customs and usages of war, especially in what I have found, especially from the Mexican Republican side. So this means that the customs and usages of war were not something theoretical, but they were actually in practice. And most importantly, they were in practice in a non-European space, which was Mexico, and which was sort of, well, just a newly independent state. And this makes also a lot of difference. And so this also completely differs from the traditional narrative where it is only Europe and the US that appear to have engagement with the rules of war in the 19th century. So this is not the case. It's not the case for the French intervention.
In your work, you mentioned the importance of Benito Juárez's contributions to thinking international law in post-colonial settings. Can you tell us about him and the aspects that have inspired your work?
So Benito Juárez was born in 1806 in a little town in Oaxaca called San Pablo Guelatao. And his biography is very interesting because he was an orphan at a very young age. And so he has some letters written to his sons and daughters, and where he explains that he always wanted or had like the will of doing something more than working in the field. Like he had like this thought of, yeah, I want to do something else. So he went then to Oaxaca City and worked at a household, in the household, like working and, helping in the household. So he had the luck to being sort of guided by someone that I think it was a publisher, book publisher. And so he was very smart, and so he then got to be in the seminar, but he didn't like it very much, the seminar. And then the independence happened, and this liberal school opened, which is called Escuela de Ciencias y Artes de Oaxaca, and there he learned law. And I guess in this atmosphere of liberal thinking, republicanism, he was taught in law, and he was very much influenced by the independence movement. And he was even teacher of this school. He was director. He taught the law of nations, for example, in this institute. And then he became governor of Oaxaca, president of the Supreme Court, and president of the Republic. So it is really like a story of effort, and especially it's very compelling during the French intervention that against all odds he won the intervention, because he was completely left alone in the battle, and he had to travel all around the country, fleeing from the French. And in all this adversity he could defeat the intervention and finally set the foundation of the Republic, and for peace as well, because this was something that he really longed for. He has this also very he has this very famous saying that it's el respeto al derecho ajeno es la paz. So, well, actually, the whole phrase is entre entre los individuos como entre las naciones, el respeto al derecho ajeno es la paz. So between individuals and nations, the respect to each other's rights equals peace. So peace was very like a central point of his, because he wrote that without peace they couldn't start with all the liberal reforms they had in mind. So peace was a central thing. And so when they defeated the French and they got to acquire peace, and I guess he was really satisfied. And when he arrived in Mexico City after 5 years of war, this is the phrase that he gives in the Congress: entre los individuos como entre las naciones, el respeto al derecho ajeno es la paz. So this really like centers his thinking about the law and international law and peace.
And what makes Benito Juárez so interesting to you personally as a scholar of international law?
So the interesting thing about Benito Juárez, well, first of all, he's a national hero in Mexico. There are tons of biographies about him, but the engagement he had and the interpretations he had of international law are lesser known. And this is one thing. The second one is that usually when we look at the history of international law, the main actors that engage with it, like Andrés Bello or Calvo, they were members of a sort of aristocratic class and so on. And this is not the case for Benito Juárez. Benito Juárez was born in a small town in Oaxaca. He was born to Zapotec parents. He was the first indigenous president in Mexico and Latin America, and so he knew firsthand the colonial experience. And as such, I guess for him was really important that law could make possible that social hierarchies, racial hierarchies, would erase that, and not also to individuals, but to states. And for him, international law guarantees equality among states, and this was very important for him. And also he believed that this could only be guaranteed under a republican form of government as well. And so these kind of thoughts are very looking forward, so to speak, they are. And he was also thinking of how to incorporate international law in domestic law, as it was the case, like, for example, these crime violations against the duties of humanity. This is a direct incorporation into criminal law of what was then called the usages and customs of war.
Turning to methodological questions, what kind of data do you need to collect? What kind of materials do you use in your research? And how do you recognize when you've reached the necessary empirical evidence?
I am researching a 19th century conflict, so it is not that easy just to look at the black and white of the legal text. So that wouldn't bring me much information about it. Okay, yes, it would bring me information about what were they prohibiting or punishing, but not really what were the reasons behind it or what were their objectives. And so in order to understand like the rationale of how did they get to that point, I tend to look a lot to, of course, history books and so on, but rather to primary sources and other unconventional sources like letters, a lot of correspondence, and literature as well. But also I have found that images deliver a lot of information if we look at them carefully on the one hand, and also if we look at the history of certain paintings and so on. They tend to deliver a lot of information. And also material sources, like, for example, what kind of weapons were they using, or the uniforms are also very, very important. And so for sure one has to look beyond the legal texts, because the legal text won't bring really much further on what were the reasons and the objectives of regulating the conduct of war, for example. So yes, this is one thing. And images, well, yes, I can think of the example of civilian armies. So they deliver really interesting information about the way they were dressed. And so they really distinguish themselves from civilians, as far as I have seen from the images available. So it is not that one could confuse them with civilians because they have like a certain way of dressing. Now, when I go to the archives, I will see I plan to see if this was for all of the guerrilla groups, for example, or maybe I could find out more about their way of dressing, about the way of organizing themselves and so. But of course, paintings, drawings, newspapers deliver a lot of information of actually how the laws of war operated day by day.
What does your research on Mexico and France tell us about power asymmetries and their effects on the regulation of armed conflicts?
So this is really important because, so we adopted, I guess, like a colonial, as a part of the colonial heritage. So we also inherited all the legal system and so on. So it's impossible just to do without it. So it's part of it. And so after independence, really, just like the European legal thought was just adopted it was something that really wasn't questioned, so let's start all over again. No. And of course, in order to understand how this all happened in the Latin American states, you also have to understand what was going on also in Europe, because there was all the time this conversation going on between one and the other. And also the actors used to travel a lot, and so there was a lot of conversation. And so it is almost impossible to understand the developments in a place like Mexico without understanding what was happening in Europe. And the other is that, of course, the legal arguments or the legal discussions that were happening in Europe were also very important, because they were talking about the codification of international law, and also international law was beginning to build itself as a discipline, as a professional discipline, because before, until the Marty Koskaniemi marks it from 1868, I guess. Before that, it was just a thing of diplomats and theorists, but it wasn't really a discipline in itself. So it is a very important moment, but at the same time, there were a lot of things happening in Latin America. And so it's very interesting to put both into dialogue, because they actually speak to each other. But the interesting thing here is that I'm not sure if actually at the other side, they were, like, for example, the European side, if they're actually hearing to what was happening, to the conversations at the other side of the Atlantic. There has been also like a sort of methodological discussion between historians and legal historians or international lawyers. But I guess, here the principal thing is of bringing both together and beyond discussions on methodology. And I guess one important thing is, what these methodology debates have, brought us to is that the international lawyer or the legal historian can't do without the context. But this is what historians argue, that we legal scholars don't really contextualize a lot. But it's obvious that you cannot do it without the context, so you have to do it. And so I guess, like, if you bridge both things together, then you can find something that resonates in both disciplines.
Tania, this sounds like yet another exciting book project. We wish you best of success during your ongoing research for it. Thank you very much for this conversation. Muchísimas gracias por esta conversación.